The Unlikely Innovators with Mike Commito and Steve Gravel. Presented by Cambrian R&D and the Center for Smart Mining.
Mike, are you familiar with the group Naughty by Nature?
Actually, in fact, I am.
Yeah, so I was going to use this is just a window into my psychosis, but I was actually going to try and spin incremental intellectual property (IIP) into their famous song OPP, but I'm not doing that now. So I just want to put that there. Today we're of course talking with Peter Cowan, the CEO of the Intellectual Property Office of Ontario, or IPON, Intellectual Property Ontario. And I was going to shoehorn that in, but now what I've been doing is not doing the actual songs, but actually telling you what I would have done if I had the courage to do it.
Yeah, I mean, you're definitely still shoehorning it in. You're
Yeah,
just
I am.
taking a different approach. I think I appreciate you putting yourself out there. I knew as soon as you said, "Have you heard? Do you know the band Naughty by Nature?" That's where you were going. So I guess you and I are on the same wavelength
Yeah.
of psychosis, which is good, as two podcast hosts should be. But nevertheless, I think to not spend too much time on Naughty by Nature, our conversation with Peter today was great. Again, I think that obviously you and I have been thinking about the advent of IPON, and because obviously I think it's going to have some impact on the college and university system in Ontario. But I think talking to Peter, I think his approach and his style coming into IPON, which is only just a few months old now, but I think where he's planning on going, I think his approach of trying to be open and collaborative with the various post-secondary institutions, understanding the differences between the universities and the colleges, understanding the differences between the colleges, right? Because certainly I think there is a big difference between some of the big players down in Southern Ontario versus where we are in Northern Ontario. I think a lot of us up here are punching above our weight, but certainly there are obviously tangible differences between us and some of our peer groups. So I think, I'm eager to see what he does. I'm looking forward to working with IPON because I think at the end of the day, this is all in service of our partners in the province who, we get the good fortune of working with here at Cambrian, helping them develop new tech, new products. And to your point, some of that is fundamental IP, but it's also incremental. But I think Peter agreed with you that even that incremental IP is still very important because it levels up to the point where they could actualize in some of those returns, and put that back into the province.
For sure. And I think one thing I appreciate in our guests, to the degree that Peter exemplifies this, is I appreciate an ordered mind. And you
Yes.
could tell that Peter has a very ordered mind when he's talking with us. And I think it'll make for a great interview and a great listen. So now we'll go to Peter Cowan.
So we're back and we're now pleased to be joined by Peter Cowan. Peter is the CEO of Intellectual Property Ontario, a new provincial agency that provides intellectual property support and services to help businesses and researchers innovate and grow. He has over 20 years of experience in IP strategy, working in both the public and private sectors, and holds degrees in mechanical engineering, law, and an MBA. And now he is a guest on the Unlikely Innovators. Peter, welcome to the show.
Thank you very much, Mike and Steve. I appreciate you having me and looking forward to chatting to you today.
Well, it's our pleasure having you on. So we will get into IPON today because definitely that's a topic we wanted to cover with you. But before we get into IPON, can you maybe talk a little bit about your journey and maybe some of your early career before you got into intellectual property?
Sure, happy to do that. And it's funny, when I really think back about my IP and where I've come from, it's definitely not a journey I could have ever mapped out. I do remember sitting in fourth year engineering in my IP law class thinking this is the most boring thing ever, and I never ever want to do this. And now I've turned it into a career. And I think why I was really become interested in it a few years into my engineering career is I was with a company that was actually sued by a large multinational. And it really helped me understand, and I actually got put in charge of managing the lawsuit as well. So it really helped me understand kind of the business value that having IP can bring. And more importantly, it really helped me understand the risks. As a small company spending literally my annual paycheck every 2 weeks going out the doors to lawyers, it was like, wow, there's a lot of cash that can be moved around here. And more importantly, I think it helped me understand that IP at the end of the day is a business. I moved into working for a large multinational soon after that and was exposed to, different parts of IP, the licensing side, the IP creation when you move from innovation to product development, about where that fits in. So I really, my journey was really about the business piece, and that for me is how I got into it. Consulting work I did for 15 years after that, and the last few years I've spent, helping some other groups, and I co-founded Innovation Asset Collective, which is a federal based nonprofit funded by the federal government on how we can actually help companies with their IP needs and IP challenges. My journey, and this will actually flow into, I think, the IPON, so I'll maybe spend a minute on it. I had a stint where I did consulting for 15 years and worked with actually mostly non-Canadian companies. Most of my client base was outside of Canada. It was in the US and Europe and a little bit in Asia Pacific. There's a different approach to IP outside of Canada. There's a better understanding of where it fits into the business, how money can be generated from it, how it can be used to protect, how it can be used to help companies scale up and protect, where they're moving. And, I really saw a lack of discussion going on in Canada. So it really helped me kind of, fuel my interest to being more involved in the country and the provinces that I live in. So my IP journey has been interesting over time, but it's always remained core around, where does IP fit from a business sense, and how can it help build something and build the economy or build value for an organization?
Yeah, and I think, Peter, if I could dial the clock back a little bit, I have sort of two things I wanted to focus on after hearing what you just said. One is, when you went to engineering school, perhaps in your first year, had you considered IP as something you should even think about, or how was that treated in early classes in engineering training?
Yes, so that's a great question, and I think my engineering training when it comes to IP, now that my eyes are opened and I do all the pieces I'm doing, was maybe 5% of what IP is. 25 years ago, IP was you became a patent attorney, and that was it. Maybe you did trademarks. So especially in Canada, there was no talk about licensing. There was no talk about, franchising and trademarks. Like there was a discussion about it, but fundamentally the education was, we're going to help you write a patent. And that is probably, the patent agents will probably not like me for saying this, is probably the most unsexy part of IP. Now, I do find it interesting, though. I will admit, sometimes I don't do drafting anymore, but my engineering training was very one-dimensional, and I think it's evolved over the last several years. There's been a lot of focus on education, a lot of different aspects. The strategy piece for me was fascinating, was never talked about 25 years ago. It was, we're going to teach you how to file a patent, and then you'll be like IBM, where you can generate a bunch of revenue from it. But there was no discussion of the in-between pieces at all back then. You know what? I think the one piece that I've found interesting over time as well, quite a lot of universities and colleges have started to realize that, and they've been putting education programs together, but it's still far and few between. And hopefully IPON can be one of the pieces that can help bridge that over time.
Yeah, and that's actually a pretty good segue for me, maybe to take that next question, Peter, would be to talk about IPON, right? So I think obviously, we know how important intellectual property is in Ontario. And I think certainly for folks like Steve and myself who are in, the post-secondary space, like we've been aware of, some of the changes and the creation of IPON, over the last little while. But for those who are listening to this episode, and hopefully it's just a few beyond, Steve and my mothers that tune in every week, as they often do, how would you explain IPON to the broader audience who may not necessarily be coming from the post-secondary sector? What is the goal of IPON? How is IPON, helping to shepherd intellectual property to commercialization in Ontario?
Yeah, so maybe I can actually dial a bit back and say, well, what are the challenges you have in the ecosystem? Because I think what IPON is going to be help those challenges. So, IPON, our tagline is trusted IP support for Ontario innovators. And why is that IP support needed? And when I say IP, intellectual property, I actually mean, patents, trademarks, trade secrets, know-how. It's not just a patent. It can be something that's in your head. It can be a process. So IP for me is a fairly wide definition. It's been there's quite a few stats, and these stats actually come from Stats Canada, that IP fundamentally helps businesses and researchers grow into the marketplace. So SMEs that own IP are typically 60% more likely to be high growth and usually 4 times more likely to start to export. SMEs that have more than one type of IP, so whether it's a trademark or a trade secret, are usually around 25 or 26% more likely to be high growth. So there is a correlation between IP and business value and business growth, which is why I became actually interested in IP, because I started to see that linkage 20 years ago. A few years ago, there was a report done by the Ontario IP Expert Panel, and they came to the conclusion, and the report's public on their web, I think it's on the ontario.ca website, but there was really a lack of, education, IP expertise, a lack of funding and resources, and a lack of centralized structure to help this. And so I think recognizing that, we have these challenges, we know IP is important because it will help businesses scale, it'll help them protect them as they grow. But on the flip side, we know we're not educating enough. We know we're not providing enough IP expertise to the marketplace. We know we're not providing enough funding. So one of the solutions to that the Ontario province decided to move forward with was the creation of IPON. So IP Ontario is a new provincial agency. We were launched, I think, earlier this year, and I was brought on board late this summer to get the agency up and off the ground. And fundamentally, we're doing exactly what the expert panel recommended. We're thinking about how we can start to build and scale education and awareness into programs, whether it's in colleges and universities or whether it's through companies that we might serve. We have the mandate to also think about how we can fund companies, how we can resource them. IP is incredibly expensive. Filing a patent costs anywhere between $50,000 and $20,000, and that's just to file it. Over its lifetime, it could cost upwards of $100,000, and that lifetime could be 10 years, it could be longer than that. So IP is expensive, and as companies, the one thing that I think working with startups and working with early stage companies, realize is a lot of times they're trying to figure out, how do I make payroll this quarter? How do I land some clients? And then on the flip side, we have saying, hey, you need to file this patent, and it's, I can retain one of my staff so I can make payroll, or I can file a patent. What do I do? So I think for smaller companies, having that funding and resources is really important. So that's one of IP Ontario's directions, is to be able to have that in place. And I think just to have a centralized resource for Ontario-based companies eventually to be able to go to. Right now there's IP expertise in this country is in very short supply. Mm-hmm. So, my peer group, unfortunately, is very small. A lot of them that I know live here but don't work here because they work for large, US or European companies, and they still happen to live in Canada. So I think we need to do more to get those people involved and have them work with companies in Ontario and even outside the province. So one of IP Ontario's hopes is that as we're building this is, how can we actually create more capacity, create more peers like myself who can come in and help companies, bring more IP experts in and be able to share that knowledge. So, fundamentally, IP Ontario is about trying to help address the education challenge we have. It's trying to address the funding challenges that we have, recognizing that, IP is expensive, and also, looking at kind of building a back-end infrastructure for the province that can be relied on as we grow and scale as the province grows, and we invest in more things, that we're also thinking about IP as part of that.
Yeah, and I think, Peter, I was going to ask you sort of to give a state of the union on what you think the state of commercialization of IP in Ontario is, but I think you sort of started to answer that in your last answer. I wonder if my question would better be served. I'll start with a short anecdote. One of the big things when I was advising companies at OCE, now OCI, was they were well coached on how to engage with a law firm to get IP protection. But one of the things that companies sometimes struggled with was articulating the value of their IP to an investor. Is that something you see as still a shortcoming among the commercializing IP holders that you work with?
I think that's a shortcoming of most companies globally.
Yeah.
So I'll maybe pause and unpack that a little bit, because I think it's actually important. So I think I when I really think about the people I've talked to in the past 15, 20 years, there's a difference in discussion when you're talking with people that have academically practiced IP and inside a business. They filed some patents and managed some trademarks, and that's it for the end of the day. And those that have actually had to fight the fight, they've had to figure out, okay, we've just been sued. What do we do? Someone's infringing on our products. We spend a lot of time and money. How do we stop them? And what I think is that until you've fought the fight or you've worked with people that have, it's really hard to actually articulate the value of the work you're doing and the value of that IP. So when it comes to pitching to investors, again, if you haven't been through that real world experience, it's actually really hard to simplify that. And that's where I think we have a lack just globally. It's not a Canadian thing, it's a global thing. So the state of commercialization from that perspective is we could definitely do better on educating companies on how to articulate the value that they're creating. What companies spend a lot of time and money, and even startups and spinoffs as you're trying to move commercialization out and find that sweet spot for product market match. They spend a lot of time and money doing that, but they don't spend a lot of time and money mapping that back to what their IP assets might be. And until they do that, you actually can't articulate the value. So I do think we spend an ordered amount, an appropriate amount of time trying to find that product market match, but very infrequently do we spend the same amount of effort as a company or as a spin-off or as trying to commercialize. Does our IP actually cover what our product market match is supposed to be? And I think if we can solve that problem, not just in Canada, just any innovator can actually do really well. What I often talk about is, from an intellectual property perspective, you actually need three minds at the table to make sure you have that match. You actually need the legal, you need the technical, and you need the business, because you have to be able to say, okay, we're moving the business this way. And the legal can say, well, your IP right only gives you structure to do this. So you're missing something. We need to add to that, or it covers it perfectly. Or if you move there, there's going to be risk because so-and-so has other rights that are going to prevent you from doing that. And then the technical person can come in and say, well, we can make some adjustments and this is how we can do that. So those three minds will actually help bridge that. But too often what I see is there's only two minds at the table and they kind of all interchange. Getting three together is, how we can, I think, improve the state of commercialization. And, jumping back to education, I don't think we need to educate everybody to be experts. I think that's too, big of a goal. And I think, quite frankly, most people aren't interested in being IP experts. I find it, I could talk about it all day. Your podcast could be 8 hours, I think, if you let me go. But I think what we need to do is, as a province, we need to think about how do we educate people with enough awareness so they know, oh, I should probably go talk to somebody about this. There's going to be an issue here. I don't know the answer, but I know what question I need to ask, instead of going to, the standard attorney and saying, well, what services do you offer? And I really hope there's a match between what my problem is. So I think if, when it comes to education, it's like, how do we educate to get that threesome together of the business, technical, and legal, and the business person or the technical person can say, well, here's the question I really need to answer. This is the product market match. How does my IP match with that? Am I good to go? Where are my risks? So state of commercialization, I think we can always do better. I think there was some research that talks about, at the end of the day, we've continued to lag in trying to move pieces out of the market. And so there's two parts to the commercialization. There's how do we make better connections between, researchers and industry to be able to bridge that. But then from my perspective, there's also, if you bridge that and have the right IP in place, businesses will reduce the risk. So I think about IP as a supporting piece in the commercialization, but definitely a necessary piece.
And I think just going back to one of the things you said there, just I want to reflect on it, because so often, especially companies that come through, accelerators, startups that go through accelerators, they're taught you got to pivot fast, you got to move quickly, and sometimes they're overdriving their IP protection, right? They're pivoting to chase a market lead. Or like something they've discovered in the market, and then they have to, the legal's almost the buzzkill, right? And then that should be a third relationship, and that's a point well taken, Peter.
Yeah, and maybe I can actually talk about that for just a brief moment. And I think about, You raise a really good point about the pivoting. And as we commercialize, I think one piece that we really need to think about from a research institution perspective is, we develop IP and we develop products, we do research, and maybe patents are filed or trade secrets are kept, and the professor or the researcher has that knowledge base. Having them linked with industry to say, okay, how would I apply this as I try to go and protect it would be incredibly valuable. You know what? At the end of the day, most patents are worthless. I've done a lot of research on this, and actually my master's 15, 20 years ago was on, how to actually predict the value of patent filings, because research shows that only 5% of a patent portfolio is worth the entire value of your patent portfolio. So, and patents are very expensive. Like I said, $25,000 to start, $100,000, $200,000 over a lifetime. You have a portfolio of 100. All of a sudden, you're spending a few $1,000,000 a year, and only one of them is worth something. So I think we really need to think about research is filed early on, and sometimes it's a hit and a miss. But following those threads to figure out, okay, we've done research in this area, making sure industry is involved and saying, hey, let's move the portfolio this way so we can actually use it when it grows and scales. So I think when we talk about commercialization, we have to, I look at it from two lenses. The first is, yes, we have to get things out the door, but we also have to involve industry to say, well, this is what we have in the pipeline, and this is what we have in the attic. There's a how do we evolve it? One of you talked about my journey early on. There was two books that really resonated with me that helped bring IP to life. One was called Rembrandt's in the Attic. It was by Kevin Rivett. It was about 20 years ago, and it talks about how larger institutions went through their IP assets, their patent portfolios and trade secrets, and figured out, hey, we actually did something that could be worth a lot of money. Let's figure out how to commercialize this. So, even companies like IBM, I can't remember the example, Johnson & Johnson or something, is one of the big blue chip companies, that they actually went back through their attic and figured out, which ones do you think we can actually spin into a commercial entity right now? So doing the commercialization doesn't happen in research institutions. It also happens in large institutions. There's also a second book called Edison in the Boardroom. And for those that are interested in learning about how do I apply IP in more structured format inside a business, those were the two books. But jumping back to the commercialization piece, how do we as as institutions, the question I would say, well, what's in your attic? Like, how could you apply this? How can you go to industry and say, well, this is what we have? How do we change it? So if you take it and commercialize it, you've already actually got good protection as day one protection, right? That would be the challenge I would, give to universities. And that's the role of tech transfer offices, is try to make that match, right? But, explaining that to industry too, I think will be helpful. I think a lot of them are receptive to that.
Yeah, and that's kind of one of the threads we wanted to pick up today, Peter, is obviously like with the advent of IP Ontario, and we kind of touched on it a little bit with some of these answers, but how do you see, the colleges and universities in Ontario, working with the new office to help commercialize IP and help them kind of continue the work that they're doing with industry partners?
Yeah, that's also a good question. And keep in mind, my answer is sounds a bit high level, but we are in startup mode. So we're in early stages. So my comments to the colleges and universities is yes, we're getting going, but we have lots of runway we need to move towards. I think there's probably three things. So I think it's the education deployment. And we have two programs, two separate basic programs that are already being developed by other groups we're going to be promoting as we get launched in our education programs out the door. There's lots of IP education out there. So let's harness that and be consistent in pushing that out to our students and our researchers. And the second piece of that is we're working with eCampus Ontario to deploy an advanced education module probably early next year, so in the next few months, and so we're going to have these on-demand education courses. So I think it's how do we get that in the hands of your researchers and your students. I was with another institution a few weeks ago and met with the tech transfer office, and they have an IP education program. I'm actually having my staff are going through it. It's only a few hours long, maybe 2 or 3 hours long, so it's not a big lift. And they were telling me that they do pitch events, and if you want to do a pitch, to get into the incubator or accelerator, you have to go through the education program, right? And it's only 2 hours, but what it does is it gives everyone the same baseline. What that means is IP Ontario can spend its time doing things on top of that instead of re-explaining the same thing over and over again. So that's the first piece. Work with us on the education deployment, make sure it's promoted, figure out how to integrate it into your programming, whether it's in engineering, whether it's in business, whether it's in like there's different faculties that I think could leverage it. I think the second piece where they could work with us is think about current and future clients of IP Ontario, that need our funding and need our support. There might be some industry partners that, advanced researchers have worked with, and they've gone off to take their product and scale it up. We're still trying to get it onto the market. If they match the companies that we can support, send them to us and say, I think we can make a connection here. I would be really interested to actually work with companies knowing we can actually trace back to some of the work they did actually came from a college and university. I think that is an amazing success story to promote, to say, hey, we helped them develop this. And by the way, they've done this in the marketplace, and IP Ontario has kind of taken over the downstream support. So that's the second piece. And I think the third piece is probably commercialization metrics and planning and how you measure outcomes. I think as a province, we need to actually do better at finding and tracking the success stories that we have, so we can actually go back and say, well, what made that successful? So I think engaging us in a meaningful way when it comes to commercialization frameworks, for the benefit of all, that there's going to be differences between colleges on where they fit in their metrics, and might use different metrics to show different successes, but there's going to be some commonalities. And I think engaging us to help find those commonalities is going to be important. That will help our organization go back to the ministry and say, here's where the successes are constantly happening, let's invest in more in that. So we can be a good avenue for that, but there has to be some collaboration on that front.
Yeah, no, I think even just in I think, the province in terms of success stories, just even when I think of just about applied research just on its own, I think that's one of the challenges that our group is continually kind of coming up against is every year, is that we're doing a lot of great work, but I think we don't necessarily do as good of a job as we could as broadcasting those success stories. And I think certainly we try to do our part here at Cambrian, but I know that, among my peer group, at the heads of applied research in Ontario, we're constantly trying to find ways to kind of really broadcast what we're doing. And, I think that kind of works in concert with what you're talking about getting those success stories out there, bringing that back to the government, bringing that back to the funders, and showing them the work that's happening and why we should continue to fund it.
Yeah, definitely. And I think if we can work together and show where the successes are, the value for money and the return on investment is there, it provides us a good avenue to say, well, not only did that success happen, but by the way, we've actually helped the companies with their IP, which has been a fundamental piece in their growth story over time. So I think it's working in tangent to understand that, yes, the applied research might go out to an industry partner and then disappears from the college's view, but from our perspective, it's something that we can watch and be involved in over time, and we can again trace that back.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, it's a perfect setup for what I wanted to talk about, just a bit more specifically on how colleges interact with IP, because it is, we think it's pretty distinct from how our universities have traditionally, been generators and spin-offs of IP. Whereas most colleges that we work with, and we certainly articulate this way too, is that we don't take a stake in IP necessarily. We transfer that contractually to the client we're working with, and we feel it's best that they then commercialize it. How do you think college applied research specifically sort of works with IPON's goals? Because I know that we're working on pretty unique incremental IP for companies. We don't necessarily track what happens to that IP as good as we should, but I think there's an argument to do that more readily.
Yeah, I'm actually going to pause before I answer that, because you said something really interesting. You said incremental IP, and I think that's really important because it's just as valuable as fundamental IP at times. When I look back to some of the work I've done with organizations over the years about how we structure patent strategy and IP strategy and how we measure it, and one of the things that when I go into an organization that they say, can you help us, reshape our IP portfolio? I say, well, show me your pipeline. And they're like, what do you mean by pipeline? I'm like, Well, you must be having innovation sessions. You must be coming up with research. Like, how are you documenting that? And I actually want to see, instead of looking at what your output is, I actually want to see what your input is. And one of the ways we will actually slice and dice, potential IP, whether it's potential trademark, it's an innovation. The question is do we protect it? And if we protect it, how do we protect it? There's a few different categories, and one of them is we'll split it between fundamental IP and incremental IP. And that might change in how you approach the budget. It might change in how you approach, which firm you'll engage with. It might change in, the long-term strategy for, patent filings, because again, countries get expensive. But it's important to actually sit down and understand, are we actually, what do we want that mix to be between fundamental and incremental? And I think, yes, you can have a bunch of fundamental IP, but you also need incremental that actually helps build the product or service into what it is and protects that uniqueness. So IP is not always fundamental. Incremental can be just as valuable. And I think for colleges and universities, I know there's often talked about a difference between the different types of research. They both have value. And that difference between fundamental and incremental, from my perspective, you have to look at it to make sure there's a product market match, to make sure the incremental piece actually has value you're protecting. And same with the fundamental. But I think it's an important piece to spend 60 seconds on, because it really demonstrates that IP and IP strategy is very nuanced. It's not a one size fits all. I think in 15 years, I've done hundreds of IP strategies for companies as part of my consultancy. I don't think anyone has been exactly the same. Yes, there's a framework to approach it. So I give that example and I spend time on that because, when we talk about applied research and how we get that to integrate with IPON's goals, like we need to think about that in the context of IP is going to be different for everybody. Like what that looks like is going to be different for everybody, but it fundamentally has the same goals of making sure the protections are there so you have future options and future rights to build a business around. So where that fits in, to get to your question about, where private sector fits in and how colleges can integrate with IPON's goals, I think it really comes down to probably a few points. I think the first point is probably really understanding what our goals are, right? I think where we fit. So again, the tagline we have is trusted IP support for Ontario innovators. I really believe that colleges and universities are actually going to be feeding the Ontario innovation cycle. So they are early on in the pipeline. So making sure there's a collaboration on how we can both help them. Again, we talked earlier about education and where that fits in. And so I think there's some pieces there about understanding where we fit and where we actually fit in a cycle together. Mm-hmm. The second is probably management or tech transfer office support. Some colleges might not have a tech transfer office, but having somebody or a group that can meaningfully engage with IPON, so we can actually understand what your needs are. Just because something's not inside our mandate doesn't mean I don't want to talk about it. I actually want to understand that so I can think about and work with the organization and work with the board on how we can actually set IPON up for success, but also ensure we're helping clients. And I see clients both as companies as well as research institutions. So I think having that, but also a willingness to listen to us on what we need from you to help you be successful and us be successful. So I think I'm very collaborative in my approach. So I think that's the second piece, is having a group or an individual that can work with us. And it will take time. I think when I first started the organization, only a few months ago, I was very surprised to learn I think I had 60 or 70 stakeholders to engage with one-on-one. So I'm still working through the list and I haven't remotely gotten through everybody yet, but that's the second piece, is working with us on that. The third piece is already talked about, is engagement in the education programs. Again, integrating with us is really around taking what we have and what we're promoting and leveraging it out. Build that awareness. So when companies come to us, institutions come to us, we've already got the same dialogue. We're already talking about the same things. Education, I talked about early on, is a fundamental challenge we have in the Canadian IP economy. So help advance that. I think that's going to be good for the institution, it's going to be good for IPON and good for everybody. And I think The last piece I would think about, and actually this was brought up at a group of colleges, I think last week that I met with, is come together. I think I appreciate the differences in where the colleges and universities are at. I appreciate that colleges are in different places individually as well. But at the end of the day, the whole is always greater than the sum of the parts, probably the quote I would think about. We talked about the IP expert panel report talked about one of the issues in the IP ecosystem is there's a lack of structure for smaller stakeholders. And that I would include, colleges especially. So I would encourage them to think about how, understanding what we do, how we can actually build our backhand supports to support them kind of as a group or as a small collective. My perspective is that I can help a company one-on-one. That's easy, right? That's in our mandate. We're focused on that. But we have to also think long-term. If I help a group of institutions with that same one-on-one effort, but then they can spread that down and pass that to 10 clients, that's a huge return on investment for us. What it does is now I've got 10 future clients that need less investment from me to move forward. So it's really about working with us to think about how do we spend our time better and more efficiently in working with the province and working with the college and universities to be able to start to institutionalize, the IP function. And I'm really mindful that every institution has their own style and their own personality. But at the end of the day, IP talent is short. IP understanding is short. Let's figure out how you can work with us to come together and do it once well, instead of doing the same thing over again that's always split up because we're splitting up money. When we launched, maybe just segue for a brief moment, when we launched IPON, Karima Bawa, who's our board chair, and I had an op-ed in Globe and Mail, and we talked about, IP talent and IP resources is very low in this country compared to where it needs to be. And instead of, always dividing and conquering, we actually need to start to pool our knowledge, pool our resources, and pool our assets, so we can actually stop repeating the same things in 3 different places and only do it once together and use that savings to actually put back into companies and put back institutions. So I'm a big believer of trying to sit down and really think, and this will be a long-term piece to move towards. How can we actually come together, do something once, do it well, and take that saving, and we all benefit from that, and take that savings and put it into other parts of, IPON's growth or back directly into companies and clients.
I think that's a great approach. I like the idea of coming together and collaborating, and again, not replicating or duplicating efforts, and having all that go back, I think, to where it needs to go to help support future growth. And I certainly appreciate that. Again, you're just getting started, and this will be a process, but we look forward to being a part of that process. But before we let you go, because you have been generous with your time, we have talked about how you're just getting started. And one of the things that Steve and I picked up on when we were doing our research was that in your LinkedIn bio, you have startup CEO, and we'll find out whether or not this was intentional when I asked the question. But we were thinking that was intentional, and that because there is a different approach to coming into a brand new entity versus an existing entity where you have to kind of adjust your leadership style because it's brand new, you're starting out, you got to do all this planning and kind of build towards your goals. Can you maybe talk about whether or not that was intentional, and the different approach you may have to coming into a brand new organization, building it from the ground up versus an existing organization that's already been kind of doing its thing for quite some time?
Yeah, so I don't think it was intentional. I think I was like, oh, I should probably change my LinkedIn profile, and what should I put? And I didn't want to be presumptuous just to put CEO, but now that actually when I look back, maybe it was subconscious. I think I've talked with some of the staff, that the transition team that was on board with me when I've started, and asked them, how has it been working with me? And hopefully they give me an honest answer. But one or two of their comments was they're surprised at the speed I am moving the organization, especially as a new agency. I am coming in, and this is why I was brought in, was to get the organization off the ground as quickly as possible, as efficiently as possible, but also, stay within the mandates and the boundaries we have as an agency. But my message to the staff is very much like a startup CEO. I am here to help build things. We need to have speed. We need to have flexibility. We need to have client focus. I want our staff meeting with companies. I think one of the transition staff said to me, I don't think we've ever talked with a company. We just talk with other agencies about what we should be doing. And I think as a startup CEO, whether it's agency or, any tech, you live and die by your clients. If you don't keep your clients happy and you don't have product market match, you don't sell products. You don't sell products, you go out of business pretty darn quickly. So I'm trying to set the tone with the team and the staff that, we're not here to build an agency for the sake of an agency. We're here to actually listen to what the market needs, and take our IP expertise and layer that on top of that and say, okay, here's what needs to be done to get that done. We talk a lot internally about product market fit, MVP, minimal viable product. So all those startup terms are used for us because we really are getting up and off the ground. We were given some great structures that were developed over the past year, prior to me joining, but now it's time to put those into action. And sometimes things work and sometimes things don't. So we're going to adjust and move forward. So for me, the startup CEO wasn't intentional, but perhaps when I look back, it was, it's the style I have. And I think you asked me early on, where, my part of my journey, and my first degree was in engineering. And I think I've reflected upon over the past few years about why I do IP, but why I still love engineering. And I think why I loved engineering is because I love building things. And for me, this is just, I'm building an organization, whether I'm building something tech or building something, for the province, doesn't matter to me. I'm involved in helping structure and build something over time. So, and I think this goes, links back to why I want to have a good relationship with the researchers and colleges and universities, and why I want to understand, how our products and how our services work and what works and what doesn't, so we can adjust that. So I'm really coming in with that mindset and very much hoping that I can use that to build something, very long-term success for the province.
I can't think of a better way to end our discussion here. That was very well put, Peter. Thanks so much for doing this and sharing your insights. I know Mike and I look forward to partnering with IPON as things move forward, but thanks for spending the better part of a half an hour with us.
You're very welcome. I appreciate your time and look forward to chatting with you again.
Yeah,
Thanks
thanks
so much.
again, Peter. Appreciate it.
Okay, thank you.
Well, Steve, we're back, and
We are.
It's funny in the intro when you mentioned, that you appreciated Peter's ordered mind. Throughout the conversation, I kept thinking about how I also was kind of in awe that he was able to keep track of his points, where he remembered that he was still on point one and then he transitioned. The thing, and again, it is around the holidays by the time this episode is coming, and this is going to be a deep cut, but I think you'll appreciate, there's got to be at least another person out there listening who will appreciate this. There's this one scene in Home Alone when they're in Paris, and they're concerned that, Kevin's home alone at his house. Again, if you haven't seen Home Alone, I apologize for this tangent. But Buzz, Kevin's older brother, is trying to talk his sister off the ledge that, like, Kevin is going to be fine because they live in the most boring, street and city in America. And he proceeds to list the answers, and he says, one, whatever, and then B, and then he goes to C, and he's just all over the place, right? So he makes his points, but he's forgot which, which system he's using to name those points. And so again, only somebody who's watched that movie like 100 times every year and can recite the movie from beginning to end may remember that line. But I appreciate that, unlike Buzz, Peter was able to keep within the structure that he started out with and move forward with those points in a coherent and concise way.
Yeah, I mean, really appreciated it. And I do remember that scene, and I always remembered, why is he switching forms mid list, right? But it's obviously because he's a moron. So the character, at least, not the yeah. But anyway, so now go out and watch Home Alone, and you know what? Even watch Home Alone 2, because I think it's just as good, maybe better.
Oh, I was gonna say, people talk about how The Godfather Part 2 is like the best sequel of all time.
Yeah.
For me, it's Lost in New York.
Yeah, for me it's Terminator 2, but you know that I'm a Terminator fanatic.
Yeah, but so. we're also it's December, it's the holiday season.
You're right.
Indulge me a little bit. So you're on the board, you're in the camp that Home Alone 2.
Oh, it's way better than the first one, I think. And it's more of a Christmas movie, I think, because to me, New York is Christmas.
Yeah.
Because, the movies we saw throughout the 90s, whenever it's Christmas, it's in a big city like New York. So
yeah, you're at Rockefeller Center, the trees.
Yeah. You got
I
it.
haven't done it. That's on my list, man. I've been in New York, but not at Christmas time. And I think as a kid growing up in the 90s, watching Home Alone, like that has become ingrained into me. So one day I'll get there. We'll get there.
Yeah, for now, I hope you guys enjoyed Peter Cowan, CEO at IPON, and we'll see you guys next time.
The Unlikely Innovators with Mike Commito and Steve Gravel, presented by Cambrian R&D and the Center for Smart Mining.